everybody know. You certainly don't have to be on camera now, but what I intend for this meeting to be is I'm gonna present the work that we did, the RFI and some of the responses we got, but then we're going to be moving into something that I hope is more of an open discussion. So just kind of be prepared for that. So everything we do at Key is pre-competitive, and what we're looking for today is to convene the kidney community and identify and tackle some common barriers to innovation. And at Key, we're at our best when we're kind of looking at issues that kind of help float all boats. So that was the reason that we released this RFI. And when we go through the questions and answers, just be thinking about anything that kind of you think that the Kidney Health Initiative ought to prioritize for projects going forward. So with that, I'm going to review the RFI and go through some of the responses that we received. We're going to look at Key's process for considering new projects, because this RFI was a scoping exercise. So we heard that there was a potential issue, and we know that there's a lot of different facets to this issue, but we wanted to kind of hear from the community before we actually began to devote resources to solving anything. So what's going to happen is, as a result of this discussion we're having today, we're going to make a recommendation to the Kidney Health Initiative Board of Directors on paths forward. Second to last thing I want to discuss today is to kind of hear from you all about any additional information that would be helpful for us to know. We know we received some responses to the RFI, but I know many people are attending today who didn't respond to the RFI. So we wanted to give everyone a chance to provide information that you think would be helpful for the Kidney Health Initiative Board of Directors to know. And then lastly, I want to spend some time talking with you all about what we could be maybe doing next. So this is just a brief overview of kind of what the sort of questions that we asked in the RFI. If you have, I sent around the agenda and background materials to people who RSVP'd, and I'm going to ask Jennifer if you wouldn't mind putting that PDF into the chat for anyone who did not, who maybe got this email forwarded to them. But the RFI is in the background material, and we're basically kind of looking at two sets of issues around verification and validation testing for physiologic closed loop systems and hemodialysis. We were trying to get a better understanding of mostly how we can clarify and contextualize existing FDA guidance, because we know that there are guidance documents out there on this issue, but they probably need to be contextualized in a little more specificity towards the kidney space. And we also wanted to get a better grasp on when we talk about physiologic closed loop systems, what sort of sensors are we talking about? Are they new, or are they old? Are they manufactured by other people and being incorporated into existing devices? We want to get kind of a better understanding of the actual products that we're talking about, and we want to get a better understanding of how a clinical trial might be structured for the testing, and how we might do computational models. So that's kind of the technical and general questions that we were asking in our RFI. So just to give a couple of highlights from the responses that we received, there were the biggest impression I got after reading the responses to the general questions was that it was important to understand if the safety sensor that's involved in the closed loop system is new or old, and if what sort of what's the safety range of the physiological data that it's being monitored? Because it seems like when we phrased questions in the RFI, we left things very broad, but based on the responses we received, there was a lot of, well, it depends on the kind of sensors that are being used, and so some more specificity on what we're actually talking about seems to be the consensus from the responses that we received. For the technical questions, we received a lot of responses about the how you would actually structure verification and validation testing, which I think is which is where we're trying to get at, and what the specific regulatory requirements were for different parts of that testing. And that was really, if there's a lot of details, I think, in the responses that we shared with everyone, but there's some nuggets in there that I think might be helpful for us to tackle as a community. So we've kind of gone through a little bit of highlights. I hope everyone had a chance to look over the actual responses that we received. I want the majority of today's conversation to be about what we could do moving forward. And I want to kind of transition things a little bit more into what might be missing based on your readings of the RFI responses and what we can do going forward. So the reason that we gathered such a large group of stakeholders together today is because Key needs your help to help us figure out how best to resource a project around this issue. Everyone who's working in closed loop systems understands it's very complex, and there's a lot of different issues packed into that one title, and we need your help to to think about how we should prioritize them and what we might be missing. So that's kind of where I'd want to spend most of the time going forward. So again, we're not looking to solve any issues now. So how Key usually approaches things is we would make a recommendation to the Kidney Health Initiative Board of Directors, and then we'd staff a project that would include members of industry and regulators who actually solve the issues. So I don't want to think through answering any specific questions now, but figuring out what questions we should be asking and how we ought to prioritize them is where I'd want to take a little bit of time and go from here. So I know some of you attended, responded, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, or those who are a little bit more new to this. So just want to open the floor and kind of I'll pull up the RFI now, and just kind of let's first tackle the question of, were we answering asking the right questions, and what might we what else would be good for the Kidney Health Initiative to know as we tackle this problem. So here are the specific questions that we asked. In general, the general and technical questions. So I'll leave it there. I'll be interested to kind of see what people have to say.
Hey, Zach, this is Michael Aragon with Outset Medical. My question is more of, I think when we look, for example, like artificial pancreas, right, there are some devices out there that are already doing some of that. Has Key kind of looked at what were the requirements, what was the process for those types of devices as kind of a basis for how we might structure this? I very interested in this idea of these closed loop systems, but I think there are some others like in diabetes where some of those systems are already out there. So is that kind of a basis for how we're thinking about this?
Yes, that was kind of that was the genesis of this RFI in many ways, and what we were kind of hoping to get from some of the responses is what we can learn from ventilators, from the artificial pancreas, who've already kind of thought through these issues, so that I don't have any we didn't receive too much in our responses around that, around other examples, but that is an area I think that might be worth spending more time on in a formal project. So you're on the right track.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Anybody else have directions they think the Kidney Health Initiative should go, or areas that we should emphasize? Okay.
Sorry, it's Michael Aragon again. I got my thoughts here looking at these questions, the technical questions. And I don't know if it's weaved into some of these, but also kind of what are the mitigations or safety, you know, what kind of mitigations or safety parameters should be in place for these. So we have kind of credibility, computation, what types, et cetera, but what kind of redundancy or mitigation is going to be needed for these types of things?
Yeah, that's good, Dr. Aragon. Thanks.
Along with what Michael Aragon had said, is Key's intent to reach out to some of the people who have been involved in some of these previous systems that are for different applications to get lessons learned and to get insight into methodology?
Yeah, that is definitely something we could do in the context of a project. Is go out. We have relationships with a lot of those manufacturers and other organizations that work in that space. So if the so there's a lot of different issues that we put forward in the RFI. So like if we decide to kind of go in, we need to explore more specifically analogous devices. What we might do is put together a project team that included people from who actually develops those devices or who are on the regulatory teams that develop those devices to think through those specifics. So if that's kind of the best way, if what we hear from the group today is that's the best way to go, that is something that we could do. Dr. Bell, yeah, we know a lot of those people in that space.
This is Courtney Elias from FDA. So I ran the division that authorized the artificial pancreas devices and created those regulations. And we worked for a couple of decades with the academic investigators who actually developed the algorithms. And so if you go that way, it may be more valuable to connect with the academics. We can help you with some of those names.
That's good.
Because many of the companies actually purchased the technology from the academic investigators who did a lot of the legwork on the early studies. And then separately, these questions definitely came up in that whole process. So I think they're good questions early on. And I don't know if this is within the scope of what you want to know, but another question that you might think about, although it may be later than you're thinking of for this type of thing, is the question of, the interface between devices became important, how the fidelity of information crossing across devices to each other, how they talk to each other and making sure that that system works well. And separately from that, but related, if the devices are actually distinct and come from distinct entities like different companies, that can be a practical challenge to translating the type of technology into the marketplace. So it might be worthwhile, making sure that those types of things are thought about early enough, so that they're taken care of, and that, people developing these products don't get stuck in sort of a competitive space that they can't then translate to patients. So anyway, just a couple of thoughts from some of the developments that occurred in the artificial pancreas, but that device communication, that device interface, and how you ensure fidelity across the two, became pretty important.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks, Thanks, Gordon. I appreciate you taking the time to join today. So it seems like kind of spending time pursuing looking at analogous devices would be the most useful way to go. We outlined a couple of other things in the RFI. I'm just wondering if anyone has if there's like some other things we should also consider, or if we can kind of tackle everything.
Zach, I think a couple things here would be, sorry, it's Michael Aragon again from Outset. A couple thoughts here too would be, we talked about what types of sensors, et cetera. I think thinking about it more from the physician and the industry perspective, but I think from the user perspective, obviously important to know either what processes within the treatment itself do users have trouble with, where are the majority of those errors that happen, so that these sensors and these types of systems could reduce the risk of user error, and then particularly thinking about home dialysis or non-professional users, what problem are we trying to solve for that group of patients? As I think most of these devices, as we move forward, I think we're looking more at a non-professional user using these types of devices. So I think looking at it through that lens as well, not just from a physician or industry perspective, but of the actual users of the device, what problems could we solve for them, or where could we resolve some errors that tend to happen with treatment?
That's good, Dr.
Yeah, it seems to me that perhaps in order to focus more on what we really want to do, you might take one or two items or issues where you want to use as examples. For instance, in hemodialysis, you have a sensor that monitors temperature. Will the machine increase the temperature because the patient's temperature dropped? The patient's blood pressure dropped? Is the machine automatically going to give a bolus of fluid? Today, if the blood pressure drops, the nurse is going to call the doctor, or the doctor has a standing order. If the blood pressure drops below X, do that. If you want to put that in the hands of a chip or a machine to make that decision, you have to basically validate that in fact the decision is correct, and if it's not, what happens? What are the risks? Another item is, are the patients going to accept that those decisions are made automatically or not? Are you going to ask them? So you might consider focusing on one of those issues, and there are many more. In CRRT, you might have a monitoring of a certain item. Patients are critically ill. Are the decisions going to be made by the nurse, by the resident, by the chief, or by the machine? Which are the scales? So you might choose 2 or 3 critical parameters that are relevant to dialysis, because that's what we're talking about, and develop from those specific items issues or decisions or mechanisms of analysis that might apply or generalize to other issues that we are not talking about now.
Yeah, that's good, Dr. Gersh. It seems like there's we need to outline dialysis specific considerations. And I liked what you had to say about the patient perspective there, and whether they would accept automated control for different things. I think that's really important. And then I think we have a separate vertical about what we can learn from analogous devices, and that's stuff that we'd have to contextualize to the kidney space. But that's kind of how I'm thinking about things.
And Zach, kind of along that line is the idea of, is there a different level of evidence or of validation if the device is more identifying a problem and alerting the user? So, blood pressure drops, you pause fluid removal and wait for the user to do something, versus a fully automated loop where the device delivers the bolus to treat the blood pressure drop. So kind of that monitor and pause and wait for user interaction versus monitor and pause and react. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
This is Dan Blumberg from Medtronic. You know, for that exact same situation, really a definition is that first thing. Even should it be considered? Is it within scope of a physiologic closed loop controller? Right. Many machines today have blood pressure cuffs and raise an alarm and stop if the blood pressure is outside of a preset range. Are we redefining that those systems today should be classified as physiologic closed loop controls in the first place and have new requirements applied to them? I think something around the scope and the definition of what will count and what will have to follow this recommendation and set of guidelines versus what's considered part of the technical alarm system governed more by traditional hemodialysis standards would be helpful.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think we referenced I know the FDA guidance has a definition of those systems, so I don't know if we definitely wouldn't want to reopen that, but it does seem like there's some clarifying that we could do.
Hi, this is Chris Scully from the FDA Office of Science and Engineering Labs. I'll just say that one thing that the guidance you're referring to, I think it's draft, not for implementation at this point, just to clarify that point, but there is a standard IEC 60601-1-10 for physiologic closed loop control systems that FDA does recognize. And as was just mentioned, according to some of the examples in that standard, the types of kind of safety stops due to detection of what would be an alarm condition, those would generally, I think, be outside of the scope of that standard's definition for physiologic closed loop control, at least. So yeah, something to consider of what the, if we're talking about physiologic closed loop control systems for dialysis, what is the those functions actually doing, and if maybe there is a need to consider some other automated functions that are not necessarily physiologic closed loop control, but just to, as was mentioned, for the definitions and the standards that we look at for physiologic closed loop controllers, that type of function may be outside the scope of physiologic closed loop control.
Thanks, Chris. Anything else on that kind of on that thread of what is or isn't closed loop control, or anything back on dialysis specific things we should keep in mind?
Hi, this is Hema. Nothing new to add to that, but just wanted to add to the discussion that as we go through the different parameters and different things that might be considered for PCLC, to keep a risk-based approach of what things, where's our comfort level, what things are we not comfortable with having as a PCLC based on risk versus other things. So just that's something that needs to be incorporated into the scope and the project and the definitions and all that, just the risk-based approach of the different parameters and their eventual effect on patient treatments and patient safety.
Yeah, that's a good point. So a lot of the thing we asked about all the different kinds of sensors that you need, and there's a lot of and the safety ranges are different for each of those sensors. And I think back to what Victor said about what are patients' tolerance for those being automatically adjusted. So that's a good extra layer of context, Emma. This is a lot more talkative group than I expected, so I appreciate it. Anybody?
One thing to add to
yeah.
that, I think, instead of thinking of it solely as, there's some things that are too risky to do as a closed loop and others that aren't. I mean, insulin is pretty risky, in terms of automatically dosing it. But the way they tackled that was fail safes. So, thinking in through the project of, what are the limits on algorithms that can help increase safety for some of the higher risk parameters might be something to incorporate. So they typically deal with that through the algorithm itself.
Another source of information and focusing of problems to be addressed in a forum like this comes from military medicine. In military medicine, things happen where there is a medic with instruments, maybe in what they call a role 3, there is a field hospital, but on role 1, there isn't such a thing. And they're trying to automate a lot of responses so they can address problems in the battlefield that you can't address because there's no doctor there, there's no nurse there, and then you have a critically ill patient that is injured. And in the future battlefield, when evacuation and transportation may be compromised and people may be in the field for a prolonged period of time wounded until appropriate care can be rendered, a lot of automation is going to be required. And those guys are busy developing answers in an area of exploration that makes the decision on whether to give fluid to a dialysis patient that dropped blood pressure pale regarding the decisions that they're automating there. So there may be a good source of questions and some answers that may apply here as well.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. That would be always kind of looking for other places where we can get extra context here. Well, is there anything, I feel like we have a couple of different directions that the Kidney Health Initiative could pursue. Does any, before we kind of, what will happen is I wanted to kind of see if anyone had a sense on prioritization of the different topics that we've talked about so far, because the other thing that we'll have to do is kind of is break this down a little bit. But does anyone have thoughts on kind of based on like the questions that are kind of listed on the RFI or kind of the discussion that we've had so far on what we ought to prioritize to tackle? Because even if we kind of look at just like the analogous devices issue, there's a lot of issues there. They don't have thoughts on prioritization. And if not, we can have our we'll write all this up and have like a discussion at the board level on kind of what the best thing will be to focus on. Okay. Well, thank you all for thank you all for coming. We had this whole time kind of blocked off in case there's like to kind of account for discussion, just to kind of review the process here. So I'll send to everyone who's on this call the recording and a write-up of kind of what we'll be passing back to the Kidney Health Initiative Board as far as possible future projects go. The board will just consider it later on in the fourth quarter, probably during their December meeting, and hopefully we'll be able to kind of kick off, if they decide to move forward, we'll be able to kick off a project in January, and we may be coming back to many of you to see if you'd be interested in helping. But again, like all of this, the RFI, the recording, and the responses, I'm going to put that all up on the Kidney Health Initiative website as well. And before we close out, does anybody have anything else they wanted to add? Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for your time. I appreciate everybody, everyone's just showing up for this and sharing your ideas. If you have any questions about what was in the responses or about the RFI, feel free to reach out to me, and we'd love to kind of engage with you all on this further. So.
Zach, one last question. What's kind of the time frame, or kind of how are you thinking? How's KHI thinking about this moving forward? Timeline?
Yeah. So the board will probably, there's a couple of layers to how the board will consider this. So we have a device subgroup that will look at it later on in November, and then we'll have a full board of directors meeting in December where they'll consider a project proposal that will write up based on this call, and then we'll probably kick off. We could kick off a project as early as January, but it depends on kind of, we may need some more scoping conversations out of this, but it could we won't have a decision on like a go no go until a December timeframe.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you all, and I'll be in touch over email.
All right, appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Zach.
Thank
you
for the discussions.